Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Imran Khan. As you've probably noticed, I've taken quite a hiatus from creating new content. I had some time over the holidays in the last few months to think a lot about what I wanted to do with this show and the conversations that I wanted to have going forward. So luckily, I think we're in a different place now than we were, let's say, a year ago when things started to kick off with the pandemic. And I wanted to start my series back up with a gentleman who really struck me as, having the right conversation at the right time. I was lucky enough to meet Mike through a friend of mine named Robin Streisand. She connected us, and Mike is just an exceptional person. He has worked as the chief strategy officer at Young and Rubicon. He's worked in media, and then he's made a big pivot into the world of mental health. So welcome, Mike. Thank you so much for joining the program.
Well, thank you so much. I really am delighted that you have invited me. I love the title of your podcast, Where To From Here, because what I like about it is that it lifts people's eyes and gives them some sort of horizon to look forward to. And there's no doubt at all that, the world has had a cloud over it now for some time. So we've gone through, it appears, COVID, and now we're into sort of, vaccine fatigue or some sort of a vaccine cloud where the only thing that seems to dominate our news seems to be rollouts and who's doing it well and who's not.
Yeah, it's definitely been crazy times. And I can't wait to dig a little bit deeper into some of that collective trauma that we've been through. Mike, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in mental health, just to have the audience get a good sense of, where you're at in the space and what you're doing?
Sure, absolutely. I decided in 2017 to reset my health. And part of that is I felt that I was getting nowhere. I've had mental health conditions for some time, and that's things like bipolar 2, depression, and PTSD. And I didn't observe those for a long time in my life. And then I began to realize that I had some things that really needed attending to, and they weren't just physical. And what I had a sort of a C-level career for about 10 or so years, and I was masking those conditions at work. I never felt comfortable about admitting to senior people or to anybody else that I had these conditions because I didn't want people to think that I was deficient, that I was a weak link in the chain, that I was slightly abnormal. And in big ad agencies and in the media, I didn't feel like they were the sort of environments that were empathetic at all. It was all about performance, and I was very conscious of that. When I left those professions, I then decided to admit myself to a facility for about 3 weeks. And part of that was to address depression. And depression is one of those things where you feel heavy, you feel worthless, and you feel sad. So there's exhaustion, sadness, and worthlessness all sort of combined with that. Now, sometimes people have that for a period of time. It might be event-based. Unfortunately, with me, it's genetic. So I've been living with this for some time. And I decided to write about my patient experience. So I decided to write what I call little coffee break books. They're books that are only about 10,000 words, and you can read them in an hour, and for the less than a price of a coffee. And so I wrote about the Anxiety Society, which I wrote last year, which was about the forces that are contributing to anxiety almost as a generalized level in society. And I wrote this before COVID. So then you add COVID, and then we've got a heightened level of anxiety.
Right.
So the sort of timing's everything. Then I wrote about Survival of the Mentally Unfittest, was a book I wrote about mental health at work. And part of that was things like the use of catastrophe language, right? And how other people, they overdo the catastrophe of what could happen with regard, if we don't meet this deadline, we're dead. You must do this. We must win this. And that's over emoting. That's almost elevating people's cortisol. It's elevating stress. Part of that also is things like text after dark, communicating with people after dark, that almost becomes a real breach of trust. That we've given you a phone and a laptop, therefore we can contact you whenever we like. And so there's a big difference between permission and abusing my time. And so I think a lot of companies aren't getting that balance right. And then I decided to move into an area of mental resilience, where I felt that my patient experience could help people. So I'm trying to create strong people, because I do see what it's rather generalized, but weak people, they feel like they're reliant on others, they're reliant on their screens, they're reliant on, be it social media, be it other groups, and they're not being strong as individuals. And there's certainly no doubt then we add COVID, which what COVID does is force people to think about things like, am I afraid of death? It's one of those really seminal mortal questions, because some people's response to COVID is, I could care less, I'll never get it. Some people panic, and then some people are fearful. And as a result of that, that's where I think some of the real artifacts of COVID we're now beginning to experience. They really forecast that we're yet to see the true effect of COVID in mental health terms. They believe that will flow through for the next few years. They don't think it's a short-term thing.
I think so. This is super exciting stuff, and this is exactly why I wanted to speak with you. I think you've already started to hint at it. There's been this massive impact on our mental health and the way that we, like, our stasis, right? Like the basis of point at which we're living, and whether that's in a mode of panic, or whether that's in a mode of anxiety, or whether that's in a mode of frustration and wanting our own freedoms. There's lots of these kind of emotions that I think are running through people now. Could you talk a little bit more about what's been that impact on a broader sense, from what you're seeing working in this space? Like, what are the things that, some trends that you're noticing that are really things that we need to watch out for?
Okay, well, I think, first of all, the gamification of our phones. Now, this happened long before COVID, but alerts now become alarms. When you get a notification, it can elevate your cortisol. The fact that you can be contacted anywhere at any time. Now, so into that, then things like climate anxiety, in which the conversations regarding climate have been, are we doing enough? And then we've got climate deniers, and then we've got, sorry about that, countries then that are moving quickly, countries that are not moving quickly. So that conversation's quite porous. Add that to the gamification of our phones, and then we're getting into things like activism and action, in which there's enormous amount of conflict regarding activism and an equalization of either rights and equity and identity. So that's happening all at the same time. So then we've got aging going on, particularly say in Europe, obviously other demographics, in terms of Australia, the Asia Pacific Rim. Aging creates things like inflammation, it creates stress, and you've got obesity, right? Also, as a key issue in a lot of modern Western societies, not the least of which happening in things like India and their middle class adopting Western diets. So there are 6 factors which have intersected, right? Now we add COVID, all right? So that being the case, the average person has got a lot on their plate, even before we get to their plate. And then we add their family. Now, families, as we know, are fairly combustible devices, and it's not a meritocracy, or it's not a democracy at all. And so those things, if we get down to micro levels, those things that I just spoke of, then land on you as an individual, land on you then as a workplace, and land on you as a relationship. Now, they're layers that continue to provide a level of anxiety. So you might find yourself, do we have more to cope with, or are we less able to cope, right? And I think both are right. I think, yes, we've got a lot more to cope with. The fact that you can have live streamed onto your phone something like the Christchurch massacre out of Facebook, in which I don't know how many people were killed, but apparently about 60 odd injured. A dreadful, dreadful massacre last year. Never before that has happened in our history. Before, it used to be, there was broadcast 1-to-1 and I could ignore that. Then we get to things like social, and it's many to many, and you might feel overwhelmed. Now we've got every company under the sun that asks you to opt in. You forget your password. It's hard to opt out. And then we've got no reply clause. I want to reply to them. They say no reply. They can't let me reply. That irritates me. Even if I get a message from my Calm app, that irritates me. There's another notification I've got to attend to. So we're always attending to things. And then I suppose the fact that you can't engage and respond properly with companies that are communicating with you creates another level of either irritation or anxiety. And so my sense is that as we sit here in 2021, my advice to people, actually, and it's what I'm doing, is almost deplatforming or taking out notifications. I'm unsubscribing from emails that I didn't even know that I subscribed to. And every month there seems to be more and more, not spam, but things, oh, well, you've opted into this, you're subscribing to this, and I can't remember subscribing to it. I'm always thinking, well, okay, well, then I'm going to unsubscribe. And then they're making it difficult for me to unsubscribe. So I hope I don't sound like an old man, but what I am doing is trying to take care of my mental health by taking out stimulus, which is not productive to me. It's not healthy to me. Now, some people won't be, and we see in younger generations that have grown up on screens, we see them, there are two things that are happening. There's a lot of teen girls that are suffering anxiety, teen boys suffering a lack of worth, and they are suffering worthlessness. Now that metastasizes into mental health conditions, almost a mental illness by the time they're in their 20s. And so if you ask me what's going to happen next, it's going to be, we're going to see the effects, not just of COVID and the anxiety of that and vaccines and then, unstable world relations, be it China or whatever. What we are going to see then is the effect of the first generation of screen time. Now that's going to pose us some real problems, because there are a lot of people who think, or they advise in this space, that we are seeing people who don't appear to be able to cope as well. And that their answer is in their phones. And if the answer, they get into doom scrolling, where they are, they scroll to the end of their feed on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever, then go back to the top, and then continue to do that for hours. I think that's troubling.
It's really, really interesting as we dig deeper into this, specifically two things that are really popping for me. When I think about what are going to be some of the long-term impacts of coming out of this or finding a new center, these two things, this idea of really being way too into our screens and doom scrolling and echo chambers and, being stuck in our own little bubble of thinking. That's one thing I find quite dangerous, and I'd love to hear more of your thoughts around. The other thing that I find really exciting, but also interesting in the challenges it poses, is the idea of activism, right? And how that activism is now going to be driven forward because of those same things, right? Like the screens, the echo chambers, and the one thing that I would add to that, and I love your perspective on, is that activism in some ways for me is really interesting given socioeconomic class, right? Like, for example, access to healthcare, access to, just treatment when COVID became this massive issue, and now vaccines, right? It seems like a very privileged class of people are getting access to vaccines before the people who might necessarily need it more readily.
Yeah,
and so
I think that's very true. Yeah. Sorry to cut you off, Imran.
No.
A couple of things there. Less than 10% of the world speaks English. There's 198 countries and there's 230 nationalities and 7,000 languages, right? So the world's complex. Let's start there. Then you've got changes to things like work. You've got work from home, you've got work at work, you've got in-transit work, part-time, etc. That's another change that we've experienced as a function of COVID. And then you've got the different digital platforms that communicate with you. Your car is a digitally preloaded program, so is your smart TV, and so is every other social media. And then you've got things which are basically like multi-generational responses. People who are senior, born in the 30s, versus people who are Gen Z, who are 15 to 22. Now, their reaction to the same message will be completely different. All right. So if we just combine all those multis together, you end up with a pretty complex model. And then we add things like activism. Now, activism always seems like it's attempting to equal out things, or it's attempting to address some sort of injustice. It's attempting to highlight, like International Women's Day was sanctioned by the UN in 1977 to highlight people in sub-Saharan Africa, women in low to medium income countries, women in countries where there is true religious oppression. All right. And so there was a really, I suppose, strong form of activism by the UN saying that here is an issue which the world now needs to know about. What we see now is these outbreaks of activism, which are almost accelerated by the internet, that before we would look upon that as not so much as an uprising, but as a news item. Now we see that we can be and we are involved in activism via the net. So the net's done a lot of great things and it's done a lot of things poorly. However, this is one of the things that, because the net's either utility or entertainment to me. And the net seems to be about utility when it comes to activism, in a way in which we haven't had a vehicle before to unite people, to give them a voice, and then to be able to take action. whether or not that was, I think, the January 6 problems at Congress in Washington, where there were people apparently busing and training in to the Congress building there in Washington that wanted to make a protest, or in fact actually issues in and around George Floyd, all that sort of stuff. But then even less, I suppose, inflammatory activism, in which we're simply, why does everyone, when I'm on a Zoom call, decide to email me? It's one of the, you can bet, as they don't email me all day, Imran, and then as soon as I'm on a Zoom call, there they are. That's someone telling me to pay a gas bill. I'm sure I'm late. So that issue regarding activism is always fueled, I think, by some sort of an event. And we've got COVID bringing into sharp relief for people. Well, who's a rich country that can afford to make their own vaccine? What's a poor country? And then why is there not better cooperation amongst the UN countries, for instance, in terms of being able to, I suppose, divide up vaccine, do it in a way which really attends to those countries that do not have the facilities themselves to make vaccine? And so this is where, vaccine's becoming a loaded word, in the same way that masks are a loaded word in the US, vaccines are a loaded word around the world. Borders and travel have now become loaded. So we don't seem to have any, and then, we've got other sort of tectonic plates in the world's narrative, things like, China and Taiwan and, the tensions there in the South China Sea. And for those of us who are here in Australia, that's a very real issue that's on our news and leading the news in a lot of ways. We've just had another border closed down here in Australia, where we closed down state borders. As soon as there's a couple of vaccine cases, people from New South Wales can't go into Queensland. People from New South Wales couldn't go into Victoria. So these are laws and impinges that are on our behaviour and freedoms that have never been there in this generation. So that's where this generation hasn't seen your freedoms at risk, or somebody's beginning to moderate that freedom.
So this is so interesting just to understand, like, we're dealing with things that haven't been present as a part of society at all in this generation, and how we're reacting to it. And I think the way that you described it, these multi-generational reactions, right? For folks who may have experienced this, less than 100 years or so ago, versus folks who are from Gen Z and having to deal with this for the very first time and having their rights really be, controlled in a way that never happened before. Super interesting. I guess my question would then be the question, of the eponymous question of the program is, where do we go from here? What is your advice? I know you already hinted at this idea of starting to shed your digital self, well, not your digital self, but to pare that back in a way so that you're not doom scrolling and getting overwhelmed by stimulus. What else would you recommend?
I think we need to recognise we're at a point in history which is quite unique. And people say, well, what can I do? Well, the first thing that you can do is attend to yourself. And I'm a huge believer in brain health provides a very good platform for good mental health. I don't deal in mental illness, so I don't deal in highly complex, intensive mental illness problems. They're for professionals. But really good brain health is based on really good gut health, incredibly good sleep, and having really good brain health. Now, that is that's the sort of the triple crown, the pillars of incredibly good mental health. And so and then add to that exercise, right? So my advice has been, if you want to sleep well between the hours of about 3 and 5 p.m, see if you can get in things like a light walk, not something like an F45 or a huge workout in the gym, which elevates you and causes stress, but do something which is moderately elevating, and that will help you sleep. Sleep, I don't know why sleep was this hard, but it's become hard, it appears now. And that's because whether or not there's an extraordinary amount of stimulation. So I start my day at 4:30 and I cut it off at 8 p.m. And having that hour between then and when I sleep really provides a great opportunity or platform for me then to have good quality sleep. And if I have good quality sleep, it changes my day. So my day almost begins the night before. What I try and do is actually ensure that I have good sleep. And therefore, I feel that when I do get up or whatever, that I feel, in good shape. The other thing is that There are a lot of things that can wreck your diet. Quite sort of unobtrusively, a lot of artificial things creep into our diet and we don't think that affects us. But what it is affecting then is your ability to absorb vitamins, your ability then to have good gut health. And like 90% of your, I think, dopamine is in the lining of your gut. So that vagus nerve between your gut and your brain is critical in terms of you having good mood chemicals. And I talked about inflammation before. When inflammation leaches into your brain, it reduces things like serotonin and dopamine. And you have these cytokine storms, protein storms in your brain. Now, you may not recognize that, but that affects your immune system. That goes into crisis. And then what happens also is that it can create things like mood disorder, depression, all that sort of stuff. So the first thing I do is attend to things like what I call my, brain, gut, and sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And next, then I get into, am I overstimulated as a result? Is my phone running me or am I running the phone?
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly got to a stage where the phone was running me. Every time it pinged or dinged or a red light, I looked at it. Now I forget how many times a day I looked at it. And I know I'm not the only one doing this, but what I have discovered is that if each month I unsubscribe from emails, view the apps very critically on my phone, get down to what's utility, what's entertainment, what do I really need, get out of that whole rings, pings and dings, because rings, pings and dings to me have become, well, that's just normal. That's just what we do. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it is, but smoking was normal once and we don't do that. So, we've got to observe when there are things that create emotions which we can't manage in a healthy fashion. Now, some people can manage their phones in a very healthy fashion. I think the younger you are, the less likely it is that you observe what's happening to you and the less likely it is that you understand whether or not this might be damaging to your health in some way, or at least your mood. So there's two building blocks straight away that actually attend to well-being and mood.
I think sorry, please.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, so they're the things that I absolutely concentrate on. I think we underestimate the effect of diet on our well-being and mood. And as hard as that is, I mean, alcohol is a product of decay. I have had various relationships with alcohol over the years. Not the least of, I did 8 years on a beer account and advertised alcohol for 8 years or so. But what I've come to realize is that it's a bit more potent than what we think. And as a product of decay, I think that we have normalized so much of alcohol equals a celebration, or a celebration equals alcohol, a lunch equals alcohol, dining equals alcohol. And so it's become completely normalized. I've had to wind that back. I think it's too easy for yourself. And they say that alcohol is like borrowing happiness from tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Which is a really nice way to look at it and say, all right, well, how much happiness from tomorrow do you want to borrow? Because I think that I'd rather my tomorrow be a good one, and I'd much rather consider it in a far more careful and cautious fashion than I did previously. And obviously, I'm over 50, and so I've had about, a good sort of 30 odd years of enjoying alcohol or not enjoying alcohol. Mm-hmm. So if we add that to, diet, sleep, alcohol, and we're observant of notifications, what you are then doing is well, literally, you're empowering yourself physically and mentally. And then you're aware of your external environment and you're saying, no, I don't think that's a healthy thing for me to continue to ingest.
So for the folks at home, I'm pretty sure that all of the things that you just mentioned are things that seem obvious, things that are things that we know but don't necessarily put into practice. So I think it's really important to have these things underscored, namely when it comes to thinking about quality sleep, having a pretty decent diet, moderation in and around how much we imbibe and partake in drinking. And I think the idea specifically around reducing stimuli is something that really pops in my mind. Ironically, and I don't know if this was just meant to be that we were going to have this conversation, but I actually started to do that very early on in the pandemic, was unsubscribe, unsubscribe. And it actually really helped, I think, in the long run, where I don't feel so inundated by the massive traffic coming in.
Well, what you're doing there is that there is decision fatigue, and you've got to make a decision about every notification. what you're doing then is reducing that decision fatigue. I've got COVID fatigue. Every time I turn on the TV, there's a COVID channel. There's now a climate channel. They seem to be alarming the hell out of us. And what I'm trying to do is reduce that. So I try and quarantine things like TV time. And if the more disciplined I am, the better that I am. And those disciplines aren't draconian. They're for my benefit.
Right.
So if I'm always on screens and always tapping into news, I find at the end of the day, I'm exhausted. If I curate that day very carefully, then I find that I'm far better in evenings and I have far better sleep, because literally the little brainwaves in my head aren't sort of like snapping on when I'm trying to sleep. So I think that's how you can take care of yourself personally. And I suppose in the situation or this moment of history that we find ourselves in, that's more important than ever.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for taking the time to give us your advice, to come speak with me today. I really appreciate it, and it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Talk soon.